Well, joining us now, Raymond Vickery, Alexander Slater, Robert Moran, and Sanjeev Joshipura. Gentlemen, good morning. Thank you very much for being with us. There's a lot to discuss. First up, Raymond Vickery, is it your sense that despite Trump saying that the India-US trade deal is intact, there is no real guarantee of that? Nobody really knows what India's next step is going to be.
Well, thanks very much for having me. I think you're absolutely right. You know, President Trump has a talent for whenever he loses to say that he didn't really lose. That's his story in regard to the 2020 elections, and that's his story in regard to this tariff ruling of the Supreme Court. Obviously, it has an effect on the tariff agreement with India and other countries. The Supreme Court has ruled that in regard to these so-called reciprocal tariffs, the Liberation Day, which he announced on April the 2nd, that those are illegal under U.S. law. And 2 out of 3 of his own appointees agree with that. So for him to say, oh, well, nothing's happened and everything's going to go forward with India and everyone else as he had envisaged it, is just wrong and doesn't have a basis in fact. The Section 122 tariffs are supposed to be a temporary extreme measure to fight a trade deficit imbalance. It goes into effect for, as you have pointed out, only 150 days, and then the Congress has to act on it. I predict that there are going to be people in the House of Representatives who've never liked these tariffs, who are getting feedback from their own constituents, particularly in agricultural areas, who are going to take a second look. He's going to have a tough time getting it through the House of Representatives. When it comes to the Senate, I believe that this action would be subject to filibuster. So it's very difficult for me to see how he gets an approval of this after the 150 days. The other tariffs, which he points out, are already in place, whether it be unfair trade practices under 301 or whether it be national security under 256 or even those that are under Hall-Smoot tariff. They require procedures, findings from the Department of Commerce, my old agency, or they require it from the International Trade Commission. So those are in effect, but those are not what we're talking about.
All right, okay, hold on a second, Mr. Vickery. Let me just keep the strike rotating a bit. Alexander Slater, I'm told that there's an Indian trade delegation on its way to the United States. They were supposed to dot the I's and cross the T's and get this trade deal between India and America happening. What happens to that trade deal, in your opinion?
Hi, Vishnu. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me on. In terms of the deal, you know, it's going to be a strategic decision for India because there are certain parts of the agenda where India is likely to see tariffs go down relative to what Section 232 or other investigations would result in. Remember, there remains an ongoing Section 232 investigation into pharmaceuticals, and so India itself may want to keep the deal in place because the deal leans in towards a potential exemption for India from the tariffs under that section. So the president has given himself multiple ways to create leverage over other countries so they would adhere to agreements that they've made with him. But again, without the IEEPA tariffs, a big point of leverage for him has gone away.
Sanjeev Joshipura, what are India's options at this stage? I think Alex makes an important point when he says that don't for a moment assume that it's back to square one for India. There's a lot in the India-US trade deal which might work to India's advantage. Would that be a fair position, in your opinion?
I think so, Vishnu. I think that's fair. I would, if I were an Indian trade negotiator at this point, I think I would play my cards fairly close to my vest. You look at the reactions coming out of countries like England and Canada, Mexico, the European Union as well. as well as some other countries that have signed trade deals with the United States in the recent past.
Yep.
I think there is still a little bit of uncertainty about what exactly this ruling means. You know, when the Supreme Court signed off, when Chief Justice John Roberts signed off today, at the end of his 10-minute sort of verbal remarks about the ruling, he stated that this court is not an expert in international affairs, is not an expert in international economics or foreign trade, but that they are an expert only in interpreting the Constitution. And so what that means, as Alexander was indicating just a short while ago, is that there are several countries that don't exactly know whether Donald Trump will try to use a more blunt instrument, albeit temporary, as Ray pointed out earlier, under Section 232 or various other sections of the of trade law. The other point I'd like to make is that President Trump has also shown the capacity to sometimes bend his point of view depending on political circumstances. And this goes back to, I think, what Ray was saying earlier about the sort of protests coming in from even Trump supporting areas where farmers and ranchers are hurting from the tariffs. And the reaction about the Supreme Court ruling from those states has, in some cases, based on what I hear from their congressmen and women, been supportive, but in other cases has at least not been vociferous in opposition. And what that indicates is that the political elected officials are facing some kind of a groundswell of opposition to the tariffs based on increasing prices in certain areas of the country.
Okay. I just wanted to go across to Robert Moran for a moment. In as much as we're talking about the numbers and tariffs and what may or may not be, what is the broader signal from the U.S. Supreme Court to the U.S. President?
Well, this is a much larger discussion about power between the three branches. And essentially, it's very important to understand that the court only ruled on IEEPA. And it's very important to note that Congress, in three acts, a 1930 Act, a 1962 Act, and a 1974 Act, gave the executive branch, gave the president power in regards to tariffs and trade. So the question is how that power is interpreted and what is the extent of that power. That was the ruling. And so I think it's important on one hand to understand that this is a technical ruling about IEEPA, not about wider tariffs, but it does move towards the idea of the legislative branch still having some input when it comes to tariffs and sort of pushing the ball back a little bit. But still, I mean, look, the president can use a number of other vehicles, as your guests have talked about, including the 1930 Tariff Act law. And the fact is that the 10% tariffs that he's using now, that's just a bridge. And then by that time, they will have had the investigations they need to back up the tariffs that they want to basically keep in place. And so he has plenty of tools, and this could be litigated further. But it is a setback for him and his administration today.
All right. I'm just going to go through a couple of the key points for the benefit of our viewers who've just joined in. So the three big announcements, right? And the immediate reaction to the U.S. Supreme Court announcement that the tariff regime announced by Donald Trump no longer stands. He's done a couple of moves. Move number one, there's a new 10% global tariff under Section 122. Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974. It's invoked for serious trade deficits or currency depreciation. It limits the maximum rate to 15% for only 150 days. It then moves to Congress, and if Congress doesn't like it, if Trump doesn't have support over there, it goes. Now, one of the fastest options for, it does remain one of the fastest options for implementation, which is why he's gone ahead and he's announced 10% tariffs across the board. Move number two, a tariff under Section 232 will remain in place. So what is Section 232? It's part of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. It affects imports that threaten national security, right? So it's used by Trump on steel, 25% tariffs, and aluminium, 10%. So steel and aluminium not impacted one way or the other because of existing laws. Move three, There is a new Section 301 investigation which could be initiated. Section 301 is part of the Trade Act of 1974. It's a tool for addressing unfair trade practices. It requires a formal probe by the US trade representative. So that's a bit of a time-consuming process. It has been used, for example, against China in 2018 for intellectual property issues. I'm joined by Aditya Raj Kaul at this stage and my colleague Priyanka Deo. Thank you both very much for being with us. Aditya doesn't sleep. He works through the day and through the night, so he's been tracking all the developments while still sort of sleepwalking. But let me come to you first. Priyanka, there's a sense of utter disbelief that, in the United States, I'm told that this could happen in quite the manner, since anything that, so much of what public discourse has been on over the last few months has been trade and tariffs. What are some of the reactions to this?
I mean, there are currently, as you just stated, Vishnu, several trade authorities being discussed right now in relation to tariff policy, Section 122, 232, as well as Section 301. So if the 10% tariff were implemented under Section 122, it would function as a temporary surcharge that would be applied as well broadly, subject to statutory limits. So the talk of the town is just, how are these going to be implemented? What is next? I think everyone is just waiting for that. Section 232 measures would also remain separate and tied to national security determination. Section 301 actions would require investigative findings before proceeding. So from a governance perspective, these statutes reflect different policy tools with different triggers, with different timeframes and procedural safeguards. So whether observers characterize these moves as surprising or just as expected, as something that Trump would do or that he had planned anyway, it depends on their interpretation, right, Vishnu, of the trade strategy.
Yep.
Institutionally, however, each pathway operates within defined legal frameworks established by Congress. And the broader point here is very structural, that trade policy tools in scope and in duration both, and their use is shaped by statutory authority, right? Administrative procedure, as well as we saw today, judicial review.
Aditya, what's India likely to do? Have you had any reactions at all overnight? I certainly haven't, but are you hearing anything, or are people going to wake up this Saturday and realize they have to get into work?
I've spoken to people both in Delhi as well as DC when it comes to India policy, and you were right in framing that Darpan Jain, who's India's chief negotiator, will be on his way to DC. This could be the final leg of the conversation or the negotiations before we see a trade deal between India and US being signed. But essentially what has happened last night is basically the Supreme Court commenting on the emergency powers and the executive overreach. Whether the executive branch really has the powers to impose tariffs under those, emergency powers. That's the question that has been invalidated. These tariffs under a certain provision have been completely invalidated. But there are other provisions, just like Trump stated. And then we had Ambassador Greer also echo what Trump said, that there are other provisions, just like Priyanka mentioned, under 301 and 232. What is essentially going to happen, what I'm hearing right now, is that instead of 18% on India going to 28%, it could come down to 10%, because these are new kinds of tariffs that are being imposed. This has nothing to do with the 18% that was already there, because that has been completely invalidated and that's illegal. So
yeah, so that's a key point. And absolutely, it's all down to 10% for the moment, because the trade, whatever tariffs were announced, Aditya, those don't exist per se. The question is whether India would actually, negotiate this further or go broadly along the lines of the trade agreement which was being worked out. Why? Because there are many benefits for us as well. Talk to some of those potential benefits which have more or less been negotiated, and whether you believe that some of those could actually remain.
Well, Vishnu, I believe that, the trade negotiations are heading in a positive direction. That was cleared by the joint statement and the fact sheet that came in. And you would remember when that fact sheet came in, there were several questions in that. And within 24 hours, that fact sheet was edited.
Yeah.
And that was in India's favor massively. So I believe what the Indian diplomats will do is not be reactionary at all. they will not comment at all on the internal proceedings of the US Supreme Court and the executive branch in a standoff right now. They would calmly negotiate further. Of course, they will try their best to reduce tariffs even further as of now. But what I believe is that the trade deal would be signed between now and sometime 15th to 20th March. And this is the final leg of the negotiation that we are seeing.
All right, both of you hold on for a moment. There's some breaking news. The opposition has been reacting quite sharply to the announcement and asking questions on the future of the US-India trade deal after the US Supreme Court has scrapped the Trump tariffs. The former finance minister, P. Chidambaram, says that the government must clarify the impact on the February 6th deal. He says what happens to India's concessions. So he's asked questions on the future of the trade deal between India and the US. He's raised concerns about the future of concessions made by India under the recently announced India-US trade framework following the Supreme Court ruling. Chidambaram has questioned the fate of commitments such as zero tariffs on US goods. The effort by India to ultimately get to $500 billion in imports from America and a halt on Russian oil purchases and the removal of non-tariff barriers. Let's go back to Alex Slater, if we can, for a moment. Alex, I think the points mentioned by Mr. Chidambaram are the obvious questions which are being asked. Number one, the fate of commitments such as zero tariffs on US goods, which were expected to come in over here. What happens there? India's commitment to ultimately get around to importing 500 billion of imports from America and a halt on Russian oil purchases. These are the three critical points. What do you think may happen to this?
So I think it's important to remember that a lot of the outcome of that trade deal was about trying to repair relations between India and the United States. There are, of course, the specific business impacts of what was going on over the last 6 months. But behind the scenes, or not even behind the scenes, in the background, the larger context was, how do the two countries repair their relationship and get back to the kind of interactions and support for each other that had been in place for the preceding sort of 4 or 5 years. And so the deal in itself is a signal suggesting that a lot of the irritants that had been plaguing the relationship over the last 6 months had been removed. That was a key point of the deal. It seems to me that no one is going to want to go back to a situation where India and the United States are antagonists once again.
Yep.
And so that would suggest that both sides have an interest in coming to an outcome that doesn't disturb what they've agreed to this point. And if you think about it from India's perspective, if indeed what we see here is that the 18% is illegal, as the court seems to have suggested, and that what Trump can now do is impose a 10% tariff, that is to India's benefit. And so the situation gets better for India under the new regime that has clarified the president's powers. And so if I'm India and I was fine with agreeing to something previously because of the larger context, now that the deal has been sweetened even further because of the court's ruling, it would seem to me I wouldn't want to back away from it. But again, it's hard to predict what countries do, and I'm sure the folks who are leading the trade negotiations and Prime Minister Modi are actively discussing what the right way forward is.
Raymond Vickery, I think Alex makes an important point when he says that, look, don't for a moment assume that India is going to go back to a situation where we have an adversarial relationship with the United States. There's a lot going for the trade deal with America. I would suggest that there may be a little bit more room now for India to negotiate. Anything further as the deal gets sort of signed, assuming it does. Do you believe that this would necessarily have massive changes on the India-US agreement?
I think it will have changes, but let's be clear.
Yeah.
We don't really have anything that looks like a final agreement.
No, we don't.
You had really an announcement by President Trump in which he made certain statements that the Indian government did not substantiate at all. Then we went to a fact sheet which really said that this is a framework and not really a deal. And then we had something that said, well, there's going to be an interim deal, but this is not the real deal. The real deal will come later. So what's going on here is President Trump trying to maneuver really for reality TV, the situation going forward. I think the good news is that both sides, and particularly the calmer heads on both sides, realize that there is so much at stake between these two largest and I would argue greatest democracies in the world that you really can't afford to go back to a situation in which you were at loggerheads. I would hope that the progress which has been made, and now tempered by the Supreme Court, will lead us further toward a free trade agreement between India and the U.S. I don't think that's out of the question. India has signed agreements with the EU and other nations. I think that what will happen with this delegation next week is that something will be signed, but it'll really be another interim measure as these two great democracies, and particularly those who are in the trenches and doing the work, come to grips with the real commonality of interest, which have to do with not only trade, but have to do with security. And all of these things are part of one reality. So I think things are going to go forward in some respect. But make no mistake about it, the damage which has been done to the international system in regard to tariffs is not repaired at all by this decision of the Supreme Court. We had for some 80 years a WTO, we had a general agreements on trade, most favored nation, and things were going along reasonably well in terms of building peace and prosperity. And what President Trump has done is basically destroy that system.
Yep.
And so India, like other nations, are trying to find their way forward to a new system which matches the new reality. I think that can be done, but it's not going to be done in a matter of days or weeks.
Alexander Slater, just going through my notes over here, in the India-US context, the broad agreement, I mean, assuming the trade deal were to happen, impacts, is on zero tariff goods. So approximately 44 billion of Indian exports, right, to America include generic pharmaceuticals, gems, diamonds, and aircraft parts. Those are slated for zero reciprocal tariffs. That benefits America greatly if this trade deal were to go through. India has made concessions. India has agreed to eliminate or reduce tariffs on all US industrial goods and a broad range of agricultural products, tea nuts, fresh fruit, soybean oil, and wine, right, among other items. So if you were to look at this, some would argue that it seems quite good the way it is, right? There are clear benefits from both sides or on both sides. Therefore, again, your thoughts on the potential impact on India and America from an economic or a trade standpoint.
Well, I think it's beneficial that these two sides are opening up relative to where they were 6 months ago. If you go back, let's say 18 months ago, it's clear that India's tariff regime with respect to imports was a pretty severe one, and that India was a far more closed economy than the United States. Fast forward to April, where the president starts threatening these reciprocal tariffs, and that seems to change the picture. Of course, in the last 6 months, we've seen some really forward-leaning action by Prime Minister Modi and his trade negotiators in seeking to reduce the tariffs that India imposes on imports from other countries through a variety of deals. And so, to the extent that the interim agreement lays out areas where the two sides have agreed to reduce tariffs or eliminate tariffs, I think that will go a long way towards enhancing trade between the two sides. I would also point out that, U.S.-India trade, if you look back over the last almost 8 to 10 years, has thrived without any sort of agreement or any reduction in tariffs between the two sides. And so this is a relationship that is sustained by a number of factors, whether it's business interests, people-to-people ties, and also the way the governments act. So there's a momentum to this, and I think it's going to continue to drive forward, especially now that the period of the last 6 months has concluded. And so we'll continue to see it grow, I believe. And I think that both sides have an interest, again, in not moving too much in the aftermath of today's decision to upset the apple cart, because, as you say, Vishnu, as you point out, that what they did apparently agree to in this interim agreement in terms of reducing tariffs is a benefit to interests in both countries. And again, I'd go back to suggesting that the Supreme Court has actually done India a great favor today, because if Trump has to use Section 122 to impose the 10% tariffs for the next 5 months, it means that India's tariff rate, separate apart from any of these exempted areas in the interim agreement, has actually gone down. And so again, I think India is in a better position today than it was before in terms of what its exporters will be facing with their goods coming into the United States.
All right, gentlemen, thank you both very much for being with us. What I'd like to do now is just take a look at what the US Supreme Court said versus what Trump has been saying. So the US Supreme Court ruling says that the president was not authorized to impose tariffs, that the revenue-raising duties were reserved for the Congress, and that the reciprocal duties are unlawful, to which Donald Trump has responded. He says all tariffs will remain in full effect, 10% additional tariffs on existing ones, and alternative ways will be used. So, so there is that 10% amount, which is, sort of non-binding. At the moment, it applies to all nations, but I think it's time-bound. I'm not sure after whether Trump, that remains indefinitely. It has to be cleared by US Congress to the best of our understanding. It's a bit complicated because US law is, one needs to go through the various provisions. We've been doing that. But I think the broader story is what we need to take a look at once again. The Supreme Court's ruling is a seismic shift. Why? Because it recalibrates the balance of power between the White House and Capitol Hill. By invalidating the use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, that's what Trump was using for broad tariffs, the court has effectively fenced in the executive branch's ability, Donald Trump's ability, to bypass Congress on trade policy. So the potential impact on Trump and his administration: number one, the ruling is the first major legal defeat for the administration's second-term agenda. It creates a massive fiscal and administrative head. For example, the government may be forced to refund over $130 billion in collected dues. That potentially blows a hole in a budget already strained by recent tax cuts. Politically, the administration has doubled down, with the president labeling the decision as being a disgrace and immediately pivoting to Section 122, which is a stopgap authority that allows for this temporary 10%, which I've been talking about. And yes, that expires in 150 days without congressional approval. So what is the signal for the broader world? It means that if an action has huge economic significance, the president must have explicit permission from the US Congress, and that emergency loopholes are no longer a blank check. And the ruling, in fact, doesn't end the trade war. Instead, it signals, and remember, when we talk about trade war, it's not just India, US, it's America versus so many other countries. So the ruling doesn't end a trade war. It signals a shift towards narrower and more aggressive tools. And some allied nations are already bracing for these blunter mechanisms. Aditya and Priyanka join us. Priyanka, let me come back to you. What is the broader political message over here for Donald Trump? He's been very critical of the judges, but even within his own constituency, some would suggest that his tariff plans didn't really blend with some of the Republican leaders' ideas. What are the political consequences in the US?
Well, I mean, that's a loaded question. The recent developments around tariff authority, and some of them you've covered right now, a discussion now on or of Section 122, existing Section 232 measures, and potential 301 investigations. They actually reflect more than just a single trade policy debate. They highlight a broader institutional dynamic within the US system as a whole. So at its core, the conversation here now is about how economic power is exercised within constitutional boundaries. So the Supreme Court's recent clarification reinforces that significant tariff actions must align clearly with delegated statutory authority. That does not eliminate trade tools. It also clarifies that the legal pathways through which they must operate. So the broader message here is very structural, to answer your question. The executive branch retains meaningful authority in trade policy. Trump made that clear in his press conference today. Congress retains the power to define and delegate that authority. And the judiciary also retains the responsibility to interpret those statutory limits. So the interplay here is not unusual. It's part of the US constitutional framework and how it functions during periods of economic and geopolitical adjustment. So trade policy often carries strategic implications with it, but its implementation ultimately depends on process here. Investigation requirements, that's going to be the next discussion here. Statutory thresholds, time limitations, the 150 days, what's going to happen there, as well as oversight mechanisms.
Aditya, the point I was going through earlier on is that the trade deal, it's not yet a deal, but, the negotiations have resulted, some in the government would argue, our government, that, it works quite favorably towards various aspects of India's economy. For example, if you look at it, I'll just go through this point once again. Approximately $44 billion of Indian exports, including generic pharma, gems, diamonds, and aircraft parts, are slated for zero reciprocal tariffs in the United States. India has conceded by agreeing to eliminate or reduce tariffs on all US industrial goods and a broad range of agricultural products, tree nuts, fresh fruit, soybean oil, and wine. On the face of it, it's a fairly equal sort of spread, right? So it's not as if India is going to say, sorry, the court has ruled against you and therefore everything stands scrapped. We've not had any discussion of any standing. Would that be the right way to look at this?
Well, the internal mechanisms in US may have an impact on the overall conversation and narrative, but I don't see much happening, or much changing when it comes to India, US. I think we are on a track, and that track will continue until the deal is signed in March. Of course, this statement that has come in yesterday, the verdict by the Supreme Court, has larger ramifications because this states in clearly that it is the Constitution that has the precedence and not the executive branch in any way. It is the US Congress that has the right and that has the power to impose these tariffs and not the executive branch under the emergency provisions. And that's why other provisions are now being considered, including 301 and 232 that Trump spoke in detail about. He has in fact signed a new provision under the 122 in which 10% tariffs have been imposed now. I think what will happen now is that the kind of conversation and negotiations that were continuing will continue. Darpan Jain with his team will be in DC perhaps by Monday, and the negotiations will continue. There was a team of the US Trade and Commerce Department here in India. We had the Pax Silica also. So I think there is a momentum that is building towards the trade deal. You mentioned some of the key details from the joint statement and the fact sheet that remain. I don't think there will be any major changes, so as to say, on these. There's been a confirmation, there's been a agreement amicably done in that after hectic parleys and negotiations. What I feel is that we'll have to wait for the technical details, just like Priyanka mentioned, on the additional 10% tariffs. And you're right, this could be time bound. This is not permanent. And we could see some aggressive changes. Perhaps the 10% could be reduced further.
Priyanka, just going through sector-specific outcomes of the trade deal negotiations between India and the US, assuming that, it does go through unchanged. There's a lot that India gains: technology, increased trade in GPUs and data center hardware, elimination of restrictive import licensing on US ICT goods. We've been talking, Aditya and me, for the last 1 week on nothing else but AI. If we have an AI dream, we need to cooperate with America. This is an area where the trade deal fits into that, the potential trade deal. Number two, healthcare. Removal of a long-standing series of barriers for US medical devices. That impacts countless people potentially in India. There are preferential outcomes for Indian generic drugs in the United States. Number 3, automotive. India has secured a preferential tariff rate quota for automotive parts that impact certain big companies. Digital trade, there is a commitment to negotiate bilateral rules regarding discriminatory practices. These are things which India actually gain. And I think it's also fair to say that, in terms of that goal of $500 billion, it's something that would work to India's benefit in the long run. Any thoughts on this, Priyanka? Any of what I've spoken about?
Yeah, from a US-India perspective, the key issue here is predictability. India is, as you just said, a very significant trading partner in pharmaceuticals, in tech services, manufacturing inputs, defense, and increasingly now in, I would say, supply chain diversification efforts. So when tariff measures are proposed or adjusted, businesses on both sides evaluate how those changes may affect things like sourcing, like pricing, like long-term contracts, what's going to happen. So if, for example, a temporary surcharge were applied under Section 122, it would be broad, but it would be time limited, which is 150 days. That structure could introduce short-term planning considerations, particularly for sectors with tight margins or complex supply chains. Section 232 measures tied to sort of national security findings operate very differently. They are very sector specific and they remain in place unless modified through an administrative review. So companies factor these measures into longer term calculations. And Section 301 actions require formal investigations and findings, which take a lot longer. So that procedural requirement right there tends to provide, even if it may be longer, clearer timelines and documentation, which can assist businesses in sort of anticipating potential adjustments. So for bilateral engagement going forward, the broader takeaway is institutional year. The trade tools do remain available under US law. President Trump in his press conference said that he is going to use them, but their use follows very legal statutory pathways. So that structure creates both flexibility and guardrails at the same time.
All right, so the White House says that India, and this is breaking news now coming in, India faces 10% tariffs. India tariffs cut from 18% to 10%. So it had been brought down from an earlier 25% down to 18%. And then it's been brought down further to from 18% to 10%. So this is what the White House is saying. India faces 10% tariff. So this is win-win for India for the moment, irrespective of what happens going forward, right? Aditya, your thoughts on this?
We've been discussing this for the last 1 hour, Vishnu, that it is indeed a win-win situation. A sigh of relief coming in for India. Because earlier in August last year, I remember both of us were in Israel when that 25% tariff was imposed, and that was increased further to 50% the same month. And that was reduced very recently after the intent to the interim agreement that was declared after the conversation between Prime Minister Modi and President Trump. It was reduced to 18%. And now, with the Supreme Court ruling invalidating the 18% tariff under the emergency provisions, now that has come down to 10% because Donald Trump has announced under Section 122 an additional 10% on all countries. So the 18% completely invalid, completely illegal, and now only 10% remains on India. This might be time bound. The implementation process, etc., would be known, the technical details, in some time from now. But just a couple of hours ago, Trump has signed this new executive order under the 10%, and that's a big relief coming for India. I would presume India would try its best that this tariff reduces further once the agreement is signed in March this year.
And I think it's important to clarify this. The White House says that India temporarily, this is the key word, right?
Yeah.
Faces 10% tariffs. India tariffs cut from 18% to 10%. That's because of what has happened in the US Supreme Court, with the US Supreme Court saying that the tariff structure announced by the Trump regime doesn't stand. So Trump responded by putting a 10% tariff rate across the world. So India, we were at 18%. It had been brought down earlier by the US administration. That's now down to 10%. However, these are temporary tariffs at the rate of 10% on India, the UK, and the EU. So what is the future? I would suspect that even the US doesn't know. We certainly don't. We've got a trade delegation going over there. It's not a delegation, key individuals who are part of that. They were meant to, finalized the trade deal between India and the US, and then this has happened. So this is going to need, one way or the other, some major policy thinking by the government of India. And I would suggest it's not going to be a full reversal going exclusively along the lines of what the US Supreme Court has done. The trade deal between India and America is important. They are very much a natural ally as an economic partner and as a democracy. Let's go across to Lalit Jha, senior correspondent journalist who joins us from Washington. Hi Lalit, good to see you. Just wanted to know, would it be fair for me to say that there's a fair amount of confusion presently as we speak on the impact on India over the long term, right? Is that where things presently stand?
Yeah, when we spoke to the White House officials after President Trump's press conference, they said few things that they have imposed global tariff on India and including other trading partners like Japan, EU, and UK, on which they had a bilateral trade agreement and an imposed tariff on IEEA provisions. So that has been struck down by the Supreme Court now. So after that, they have brought in a new provision of global tariff of 10%, which is now having been imposed on India, including other trading partners. But at the same time, they also said this is temporary. They haven't given a timeline. But the senior administration officials and several cabinet ministers, including Treasury Secretary and USTR Ambassador Green, also said that they are looking into other provisions so that they can bring back the original tariff, which was on other countries.
All right, Lalit, we'll leave it over there. Thanks very much for joining us with those details. This is all a developing story, and I suspect that perhaps the biggest story, more than just tariffs, is the implication on Donald Trump with the US Supreme Court's, striking down something as big as this, and some would suggest restoring the power between the judiciary and the constitutional breakup of power in the United States has been restored. We're going to leave it over there, come back with the very latest.